A billionaire hired a homeless woman to babysit his 4-year-old son for one day. He installed cameras in every room. That night, he checked the footage. She didn't steal anything. She didn't neglect the child. She didn't make a single phone call. But what she did at 2:47 that afternoon made him rewind the tape 3 times, because in that moment, she revealed something she never meant for anyone to see. And it didn't just change his son's life. It broke open a truth about himself he'd been running from for years. 41-year-old Darnell Whitfield had built everything a man could build. CEO of Whitfield Capital Holdings, a commercial real estate empire worth $8.7 billion, headquartered in the heart of Atlanta, 37 floors of glass and steel bearing his name. A penthouse on the 47th floor of a building he owned outright, with a view that stretched from Midtown to Stone Mountain on a clear day. His desk was hand-carved walnut. His suits were custom-tailored in Milan. His watch alone cost more than most families earned in 2 years. But there was only one photograph on that desk. Just one. A woman with deep brown eyes and a smile that made the whole room feel warmer. Amara, his wife, dead 2 years now, pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by September, 6 months. That was all the universe gave him to prepare for the rest of his life without her. Darnell came from nothing. Bankhead, Southwest Atlanta. The kind of neighborhood where ambition either saved you or buried you. His father left before he could walk. His mother, Lorraine Whitfield, raised him alone on a housekeeper's wages and a philosophy forged in survival. You don't need anyone, Darnell. Self-reliance is everything. People will let you down. Money won't. He'd carried those words like armor for 41 years, built his empire brick by brick with them, never asked for help, never leaned on anyone, never trusted a soul he hadn't vetted, verified, and contractually bound. And then Amara died. And the armor cracked, not visibly, not to the investors or the board members or the journalists who profiled him in Forbes. To them, Darnell Whitfield was granite, unshakable. A man who closed a $400 million deal 3 weeks after his wife's funeral and never missed a quarterly target. But inside that penthouse behind those floor-to-ceiling windows, the truth was quieter and far more devastating. His son Jalen was 4 years old, brown eyes like his mother, same dimple on the left cheek, same way of tilting his head when he was thinking. Before Amara died, Jalen talked constantly, full sentences by 2.5, singing songs in the bathtub, naming every car on the highway, asking why the moon followed them home. After the funeral, the words stopped. Not all at once. First, the songs disappeared, then the questions, then the full sentences shrank to fragments. Fragments became whispers, whispers became silence. By the time 6 months had passed, Jalen barely spoke at all. His pediatrician called it selective mutism, linked to grief trauma. His therapist said it was the brain's way of protecting itself from pain too large for a 4-year-old to carry. Darnell understood the diagnosis. He did not understand how to fix it. He hired babysitters, the best agencies in Atlanta, vetted certified background-checked CPR-trained professionals who charged $200 an hour and came with glowing references. The first one lasted 3 weeks. Jalen refused to eat when she was in the room. The second lasted 9 days. She found him hiding under his bed at 2 in the morning, clutching Amara's old teddy bear, rocking in silence. The third quit after 4 days. Said the child made her feel like a ghost in his own home. 4, 5, 6, 7, each one more qualified than the last, each one defeated by the same thing. A little boy who had decided somewhere deep in the architecture of his grief that opening up to another person meant losing them, and he would not survive losing again. Darnell could buy buildings, he could buy companies, he could buy islands if the mood struck him. But he could not buy his son's voice back. He could not purchase trust or safety or the feeling of a mother's arms that no longer existed. Some nights, he stood in Jalen's doorway and watched his son sleep. The boy curled around that teddy bear like it was the last solid thing in his world. Amara's bear, still faintly carrying her perfume if you held it close enough. Darnell would stand there wanting to cross the room, wanting to lie down beside his son and hold him until the silence broke. But something stopped him every time. Some wall he didn't know how to climb. He had built an empire out of steel and numbers. But he could not build a bridge 3 footsteps long to reach his own child. The 7th babysitter quit on a Sunday evening. Left a voicemail because she didn't have the courage to say it to his face. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitfield, but your son doesn't need a babysitter. He needs his mother. And I can't be that. Nobody can." Darnell played the message twice. Then he sat in his penthouse surrounded by art worth millions and silence worth nothing, and for the first time since Amara's death he felt the full weight of a truth he'd been outrunning. He was losing his son. Not to illness, not to accident, but to the slow, invisible erosion of a child who had forgotten how to feel safe in the world. And all the money on earth could not stop it. Monday morning arrived like a verdict. Darnell had exactly 1 day he could not afford to miss. The board of Whitfield Capital Holdings was meeting at 9 sharp to finalize the acquisition of a $1.2 billion mixed-use development in Midtown. 18 months of negotiation. 3 competing bids eliminated. Regulatory approvals secured. This was the deal that would cement his legacy, the crown jewel of a portfolio that already stretched across 14 states. His presence was not optional. His CFO had made that abundantly clear in 4 separate emails and 2 increasingly urgent phone calls over the weekend. But the 7th babysitter was gone. And Jalen could not be alone. Darnell called Premier Nannies of Atlanta at 6:45 in the morning. The line rang 3 times before a woman answered, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone about to deliver bad news. "Mr. Whitfield, I'm going to be honest with you. 7 caregivers in 7 months. That's a file no agency wants to touch. I can't send another person into that situation without more information. Without a behavioral assessment, without a transition plan." He tried 2 more agencies. Same answer, different words, same wall. His mother, Lorraine, was in Detroit visiting her sister, a 4-hour flight at best. Even if she left immediately, she wouldn't land until noon. Too late, far too late. At 7:02, with the clock grinding toward a meeting he could not miss and a child he could not leave, Darnell made one last call. Dr. Tanya Webb, Jalen's pediatrician. Not for a medical appointment, for help, for an answer, for anything. Dr. Webb picked up on the second ring. She listened without interrupting. Then she said something Darnell had never heard from any of the specialists, therapists, or child care professionals he'd consulted over the past 7 months. Darnell, selective mutism in bereaved children isn't a choice. It's not defiance. It's not stubbornness. It's the brain's emergency shutdown. When a child loses their primary attachment figure, especially before age 5, the nervous system goes into a protective mode. Speech requires vulnerability. It requires trust that the world is safe enough to put your voice into. Jalen's brain has decided the world is not safe, so it locked the door. She paused. And here's what none of those agencies understand. Jalen doesn't need the most qualified person. He needs the safest person. Someone who won't push, someone who won't perform, someone whose presence feels like permission, not pressure. Sometimes, Darnell, that person comes from the last place you'd expect. He thanked her, hung up, sat in the silence of his kitchen where Amara used to sing while she cooked, where Jalen used to dance on the tile floor in his socks. Now the kitchen was spotless. Professional cleaners twice a week, every surface gleaming, and completely unbearably empty. He looked through the doorway into the playroom. Jalen sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor, Amara's teddy bear locked in his arms, his eyes open but focused on nothing. No sound, no movement. Just a 4-year-old boy holding on to the only thing that still smelled like the person who made the world make sense. Darnell grabbed his keys. Whatever he was about to do, he had to do it now. 7:15 in the morning, Darnell pulled his black Maybach into a gas station on the corner of Donald Lee Hollowell Parkway, 3 blocks from where he grew up. Bankhead. The neighborhood that raised him before money rewrote his address. He hadn't stopped here in years, maybe longer. The kind of place his driver usually bypassed without a second thought on the way to the airport. But today, he was driving himself. Jalen sat in the back seat, strapped into a car seat that cost $600 and looked like it belonged in a spacecraft. The boy stared out the window, silent, hands resting on the teddy bear in his lap. Not crying, not fussing, just absent. Like a passenger on a train who'd stopped caring about the destination. Darnell went inside for coffee. Black. No sugar. The kind of coffee you drink not because you enjoy it, but because you need your hands to stop shaking. When he stepped back outside, he saw her. She was sitting on the concrete steps beside the entrance. A woman, maybe early 30s, lean frame not from fitness, but from the kind of hunger that files down a body over months. Her clothes were worn but clean, deliberately clean. The kind of clean that takes effort when you don't have a washing machine, when you hand scrub fabric in a shelter bathroom at 5 in the morning because dignity is the last thing you own and you refuse to let it go. Her hair was pulled back tight, neat, controlled, like she was holding herself together from the outside in. But it was the book that stopped him. She was reading, not a phone, not a magazine someone left on a bus, an actual book, paperback, dog-eared pages, cracked spine from rereading. The cover was faded, but Darnell could still make out the title. The Whole Brain Child by Daniel Siegel. He knew that book. Dr. Webb had recommended it months ago. It was sitting unread on his nightstand, still in the Amazon packaging, buried under merger documents and earnings reports. And here was a woman with no home, no job, no visible possessions beyond a backpack and a plastic bag sitting on a gas station. Step at 7:15 in the morning, reading a book about childhood neuroscience. Reading it like it mattered. Like the words inside were food, and she was starving for them. Something snagged in Darnell's chest. A thread he couldn't name, pulling at something he couldn't see. He stopped walking, coffee in hand, 3 feet from his car, and did something entirely out of character for a man who had spent 41 years keeping strangers at arm's length. Good book. She looked up. No startle, no performance. Just steady brown eyes, meeting his, with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst thing you can imagine. Depends. You got kids. I do. A son, 4 years old. She studied him for a half second. Then her gaze drifted past his shoulder through the tinted rear window of the Maybach and landed on Jalen. She looked at the boy for maybe 3 seconds, 4 at most. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. A recognition, the kind that doesn't come from textbooks. That boy is sad, she said quietly. Not a question, a statement, delivered with the certainty of someone who recognized sorrow because she carried her own. Darnell felt the words land in his ribs like a fist, because she was right. Every specialist had used softer language, processing, adjusting, working through stages. Every babysitter had smiled and said he'll come around, just give it time. But nobody not once in 7 months had looked at Jalen and simply named the truth that was sitting right there on the surface of that child's face. That boy is sad. 3 words. And they cut through every layer of money and protocol and professional distance like a blade through paper. Darnell stood on the asphalt coffee, going cold in his hand, staring at a homeless woman who had just done in 3 seconds what 7 certified caregivers had failed to do in 7 months. She had seen his son, not assessed him, not diagnosed him, seen him, and something in Darnell, something he thought Amara had taken with her when she died, flickered back to life. He sat in the Maybach for 90 seconds, engine idling, hands on the steering wheel, brain at war with itself. The logical side, the side his mother had built, the side that closed billion-dollar deals and never made a move without a contingency plan, that side was screaming. She's a stranger. She's homeless. You know nothing about her. No background check. No references. No license. No credentials. This is reckless. This is irresponsible. This is everything you taught yourself never to do. But the other side. Amara's side. The side that believed in things you couldn't quantify on a spreadsheet. That side whispered something quieter. She saw him, Darnell. She looked at your son for 3 seconds and saw what you've been too afraid to name for 7 months. What does that tell you? He checked the rearview mirror. Jalen sat motionless, bare in his lap, eyes on nothing. Darnell opened the door, walked back to the concrete steps where the woman was still reading. She didn't look up until his shadow crossed the page. I need someone to watch my son today. Just today. One day. I'll pay $500. She closed the book slowly, looked at him like he'd spoken in a language she was still translating. I don't have ID on me. I sleep at the shelter on Jefferson Street. I know, Darnell said. And I have security cameras in every room of my home, every corner. You'll be monitored the entire time. But my son won't know that. To him, you're just someone who came to visit. Silence hung between them like a held breath. Why me? She asked. You don't know me. Because you saw something in my son that 7 trained professionals missed. Because you're sitting on a gas station step reading a book about how children's brains work. And because I'm out of options and out of time, and my gut is telling me something my head can't explain. Keisha Monroe studied his face. No gratitude, no eagerness, no desperation, just measurement. Like she was weighing him the same way he was weighing her. Then she said something that made Darnell's breath catch. I'll do it. On one condition. If your son doesn't want me there, I leave. No argument. No second chances. Children know who's safe and who isn't. You let him decide. Not you. Not me. Him. His mother's voice erupted in his skull like a siren. Never trust a stranger, Darnell. Especially someone who has nothing to lose. People without stakes are the most dangerous people alive. But beneath that voice, quieter, warmer, steady as a heartbeat, came another, Amara. On her last night, machines beeping, hand in his. Eyes barely open, but locked on his like she was memorizing him for wherever she was going. Don't let Jalen forget how to love Darnell. Promise me. Don't let him turn into a fortress. He's just a little boy. He needs softness. He needs trust. Promise me. He'd promised. He'd broken that promise every single day for 2 years. Darnell looked at Keisha Monroe. Homeless, credentialless, unknown, holding a dog-eared book about children's brains like it was scripture. Deal, he said. And the word felt like stepping off a cliff with no parachute and trusting the wind to carry him. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. Keisha stepped out and stopped. Her sneakers met marble so polished she could see her own reflection staring back at her from the floor. The ceiling stretched up 14 feet. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Atlanta skyline like a painting nobody had bothered to hang. The living room alone was bigger than the entire shelter she'd slept in last night. Bigger than the apartment she'd lost. Bigger than any space she'd occupied in 3 years. Darnell moved quickly. Tour guide efficient. Kitchen's through there. Fridge is stocked. Help yourself to anything. Playroom is down the hall on the left. Jalen's bedroom is the second door. Bathroom across from it, he pointed. He listed. He rattled off information like a man who was already late because he was. Jalen sat on the playroom floor, cross-legged, teddy bear in his arms. He didn't look up when they entered. Didn't flinch. Didn't acknowledge that a stranger had just walked into his world. He simply existed in his corner, like a small island surrounded by an ocean of hardwood and silence. Darnell knelt down. Hey buddy, this is Miss Keisha. She's going to hang out with you today while Daddy goes to work. Okay, nothing. Not a blink. Not a nod. Just the bear held tighter. Darnell looked at Keisha. She saw it in his eyes. The apology. The shame. The quiet terror of a father who didn't know how to reach his own son. He'll be fine, Keisha said. Go. Darnell hesitated for one more second. Then he left. The front door clicked shut. The elevator hummed. And then it was just Keisha and a 4-year-old boy in a penthouse that cost more than she would earn in 10 lifetimes. She didn't walk toward him. She didn't crouch down and introduce herself with a bright voice and a big smile the way every babysitter before her probably had. She didn't pull out a toy or suggest a game or ask him what he wanted to do. She did none of that. Instead, Keisha walked to the opposite corner of the playroom, about 10 steps away from Jalen. She sat down on the floor, cross-legged, mirror image of the boy without meaning to be. She reached into her bag, pulled out her book, the same battered paperback she'd been reading at the gas station, and opened it to a dog-eared page, and she read. No words, no eye contact, no pressure, just presence. Quiet, steady, unthreatening presence. Like a tree planted at the edge of a field, not moving toward anything, not demanding anything, just there. The penthouse was silent, except for the hum of the climate control system and the occasional creak of the building settling 47 stories above the earth. Keisha turned pages. Jalen held his bear. Neither looked at the other. Neither moved. 5 minutes. 10. 15. 20. At the 20-minute mark, something shifted. Not a sound. Not a word. Just a movement so small you'd miss it if you weren't paying the kind of attention Keisha was paying. Jalen's eyes moved. A quick sideways glance. Fast. Furtive. Like a deer checking whether the figure at the edge of the clearing was dangerous. Keisha didn't look up, didn't react, just kept reading. Her posture soft, her breathing even. Every part of her body communicating one message. I'm not coming for you. I'm just here. 10 more minutes passed. Then Jalen did something he hadn't done with any of the 7 babysitters who came before. He pushed the teddy bear. Not far, maybe half a step toward Keisha. Then he pulled his hands back to his lap and went still again. Keisha saw it. Of course she saw it, but she didn't react. Didn't reach for the bear. Didn't smile. Didn't say, "Oh, what a cute bear." She just turned another page. Calm, patient. As if she had nowhere else on earth to be. And for the first time in 3 years, that was almost true. 5 more minutes. Jalen pushed the bear again. 1 more step closer, then retreated to his spot, testing, measuring, gauging whether this stranger was going to lunge at the opening or respect the distance. Keisha kept reading. And behind the curtain of her book, hidden from the boy's careful eyes, Keisha Monroe smiled. Small, private. The kind of smile that comes from recognizing a pattern you know by heart. Because she understood exactly what was happening. This child was testing her the same way she was being tested. 2 trials running on the same clock. A boy deciding whether a stranger was safe, and a man deciding whether a stranger was trustworthy. Same question. Different cameras. And between them, on the polished hardwood floor, a worn teddy bear sat in the middle of the room, like a bridge that was only half built, waiting for someone patient enough to let the other side come to them. 10:30 in the morning. Conference Room B on the 29th floor of the Whitfield Capitol Building in Midtown Atlanta. 12 people around a mahogany table. CFO Roland Drake walking through a projection of revenue forecasts. Legal counsel outlining contingency clauses. The $1.2 billion Midtown acquisition, 18 months in the making, entering its final phase. Darnell sat at the head of the table. Custom suit, titanium pen. The posture of a man in complete control. But under the table his phone was already open. The Nanny Cam app glowed on the screen. 4 feeds, 4 camera angles, living room, playroom, kitchen, hallway. Tiny squares of footage streaming in real time from 47 floors above the city. He glanced down. Playroom camera. Keisha sat on the floor, reading. Jalen sat in his corner. Bear in his lap. Neither had moved. Darnell frowned. She's not doing anything. No interaction. No engagement. No toys. No conversation. She's just sitting there reading a book on my floor. What kind of babysitting is this? His thumb hovered over his phone. Part of him wanted to call. To tell her to try harder. To do something. Engage the child. Isn't that what he was paying $500 for? But then he paused. He thought about babysitter number 1. Jennifer. Agency certified. Glowing reviews. She'd arrived with a bag full of activities and a schedule planned to the minute. Jalen hid under his bed within 20 minutes. Babysitter number 3. Diana. Child psychology minor. She'd tried to coax Jalen into conversation with puppets and flashcards. He'd stared through her like she was made of glass. Number 5. Andre. Male energy, the agency had suggested. Maybe the boy needs a different presence. Jalen wouldn't come out of his room for 6 hours. Every single one of them had pushed, engaged, tried, and every single one of them had been met with a wall that only grew higher with each attempt. Keisha was the first person who chose not to push at all. Darnell stared at the screen, and slowly something rearranged itself inside his understanding. She wasn't doing nothing. She was doing the hardest thing. She was waiting. 11:15. Kitchen camera. Keisha stood up, walked to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator. Darnell's eyes locked on the feed. His chest tightened. Here it comes. The voice of his mother whispered from somewhere in his memory. Watch what people do when they think no one's looking, Darnell. That's who they really are. Keisha pulled out a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, a carton of milk. She set them on the counter, made a sandwich, cut it carefully. Then she reached into the cabinet, found a drinking glass, and pressed it rim down into the bread like a cookie cutter. A star. She'd cut the sandwich into the shape of a star. She poured a small glass of milk. Set the plate and the glass on the playroom floor, midway between her corner and Jalen's. Not next to the boy. Not handed to him. Just placed. Gently. In the neutral space between them. Then she walked back to her corner and sat down. Picked up her book. Didn't say a word. Darnell watched the playroom camera. Jalen stared at the plate, the star-shaped sandwich, the glass of milk. His head tilted slightly. The first visible reaction Darnell had seen from his son in weeks. 1 minute passed. 2, 5, 7, 10. At the 11-minute mark, Jalen uncrossed his legs, crawled forward, slowly, carefully, like an animal approaching something that might disappear. He reached the plate, picked up the sandwich, looked at the star shape, turned it in his small hands, then took a bite and ate. Darnell's breath left his body. His shoulders dropped 3 inches, his hand pressed flat against the conference table. The CFO was mid-sentence about tax incentive structures. The lawyers were debating liability thresholds. A $1.2 billion deal hummed around him like a machine he'd built and no longer cared about operating. Because on a 4-inch phone screen under a mahogany table his son had just chosen to eat. Not because someone forced him, not because someone begged or bribed or performed. Because a woman he'd known for 3 hours had placed a star-shaped sandwich on the floor and trusted a 4-year-old to come to it on his own terms. 7 babysitters, 7 failures. Exposed in 11 minutes by a homeless woman with a jar of peanut butter and the patience to wait. Darnell locked his phone, looked up at the room full of executives, nodded as if he'd been listening. But inside something had shifted. The deal was worth $1.2 billion. The sandwich was worth more. 12:30 in the afternoon. Kitchen camera. Keisha moved through the kitchen like someone who'd spent years feeding people. Efficient, deliberate, no wasted motion. She opened the refrigerator and took inventory the way a nurse might check a supply closet. Grilled chicken from a meal prep container. Rice in a glass bowl. Broccoli. Carrots. She heated the chicken and the rice. Steamed the broccoli until it was soft but not mushy. Then she took a knife and cut the chicken into pieces no larger than the tip of her thumb. Small enough for a 4-year-old to chew without risk. Precise, practiced. The kind of cuts that don't come from reading a parenting blog. They come from doing it 1,000 times before. She set the plate in front of Jalen's spot on the playroom floor. Same ritual as before. No announcement. No come eat, sweetie. Just placement. Quiet offering. Then she sat across from him with nothing but a glass of water. Jalen ate. Slowly, carefully. 1 piece of chicken at a time. Then a spoonful of rice. Then a broccoli floret he inspected for 4 full seconds before biting into it. It was the most food Darnell had seen his son eat voluntarily in months. Keisha sat across from him, water in her hand. Nothing else. She didn't eat. Darnell noticed it at first, like background noise. She's probably not hungry. She probably ate before she came. Then the thought sharpened. She came from a gas station step in Bankhead at 7:15 in the morning. Where exactly would she have eaten? 1:05 in the afternoon. Jalen was back in the playroom with his bear and a set of wooden blocks he'd pulled from a shelf. Building something, tearing it down, building again. The closest thing to play Darnell had witnessed in a long time. Keisha stood in the kitchen doorway. She looked both ways, down the hall, back toward the playroom. Then she walked to the refrigerator, opened it. Darnell leaned closer to his phone screen. The shelves were full. Leftovers, fresh fruit, deli meats, yogurt, cheese, containers of soup, a fully stocked refrigerator in a billionaire's penthouse. Enough food to feed a family for a week. And Keisha stood in front of it like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff. She reached in, then stopped. Her hand hung in the air for 2 seconds. 3, 4. Then she pulled it back, closed the door, turned around, pressed her palm flat against her stomach, and Darnell saw it. The slight tremor in her fingers, the way her jaw tightened, the almost invisible press of her hand against her midsection, the universal gesture of a body reminding its owner that it needed fuel. She was hungry, visibly physically hungry, standing in front of a refrigerator full of food that no one was watching, no one was counting. No one would have noticed if she'd taken a piece of chicken, a slice of bread, an apple, anything. The camera was running, but she didn't know he was watching. She didn't know anyone would ever review this footage. As far as Keisha Monroe knew, she was completely alone with a sleeping child and a refrigerator that could have fed her for the first time in who knows how long, and she chose not to take. Darnell set his phone down on the conference table. His hand was shaking, not with anger, not with suspicion, with something he couldn't name, something that felt like the opposite of everything his mother had taught him. Lorraine Whitfield's voice crawled through his mind like smoke. The ones with nothing are the most dangerous, Darnell. They'll take whatever isn't nailed down and come back for the nails. But the woman on the screen hadn't taken a thing. She had served a child she didn't know, cooked food she wouldn't eat, stood before abundance she couldn't access in her normal life, and walked away from it with trembling hands and an empty stomach. Not because someone was watching, but because that's who she was when no one was. And somewhere in the basement of his certainty, a crack appeared in a wall Darnell had spent 41 years building. 2:30 in the afternoon. Living room camera. Jalen was asleep on the sofa, his small body curled into the cushions, teddy bear locked under one arm, breathing slow and even. The kind of sleep that only comes when a child's nervous system has decided even briefly that the world is safe enough to let go. Keisha stood over him. She pulled a throw blanket from the back of the couch and draped it over his body, carefully, the way you cover something precious. She tucked the edges around his shoulders, checked that his face was clear, that his breathing was unobstructed. Then she placed her hand on his forehead, just for a moment, checking for warmth, the instinct of someone who'd done this before, not for a job, for love. She stepped back, looked at him for a long moment, then turned and walked to the bathroom, closed the door behind her. Camera angle switched. Bathroom feed, high mount. The frame showed the upper half of the room, sink, mirror, Keisha's face and shoulders. She stood at the sink, both hands on the counter, head down, breathing. For 30 seconds, nothing happened, just breathing, deep, controlled, the kind of breathing people do when they're trying to keep something locked inside their chest from escaping. Then, at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon, Keisha Monroe sat down on the bathroom floor. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, and broke. Not gently, not quietly. This wasn't a tear rolling down a cheek. This was the kind of crying that comes from the deepest floor of a person, the sub-basement, where grief stores everything you've refused to feel for months, maybe years. Her shoulders shook. Her hands clamped over her mouth to muffle the sound. Every muscle in her body contracted around a pain she would not let escape that room. She cried like a woman who hadn't allowed herself to cry in front of anyone in a very long time. Like a woman who had been holding the sky up with broken arms and finally found 4 walls where she could set it down. Even if only for a moment. Darnell watched from his office. Alone now. Door closed. Meeting adjourned. The footage played on his laptop screen. He watched her shoulders heave, watched her hands press harder against her mouth, watched her rock slightly on the tile floor like a child self-soothing in the dark. Then she stopped, She went still, wiped her face with the back of her hands, stood up, turned on the faucet, splashed cold water on her cheeks, looked at herself in the mirror, and Darnell saw her lips move, barely. A whisper meant for no one but the woman in the glass. "Not today. He needs you. Get up." 5 words, 5 syllables of survival compressed into a single breath. The mantra of someone who had been through something so heavy that getting through one day required a spoken command to her own body. She dried her face with a hand towel, straightened her shirt, took one more breath, then opened the bathroom door, walked back to the living room, and sat down on the floor beside the sofa where Jalen slept. And she began to sing, low, almost a whisper, a melody so soft the microphone on the camera barely caught it. A lullaby, familiar at first, the opening notes of a song most people know. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." But then the lyrics shifted, changed, became something different, something personal, words that didn't belong to the original, a version rewritten by a mother's hand. For a specific child, with specific love. Darnell heard it, and his blood went cold. He knew that melody. He knew those words. Not the standard version, the changed version, the private version, the one Amara had written herself sitting in a rocking chair in Jalen's nursery 3 years ago. The one she'd hummed every night, even in the hospital, even when the morphine made her forget where she was. The one nobody else in the world had ever heard, because Amara had never written it down, had never recorded it, had never sung it for anyone except Jalen. And now, a stranger was singing it on his living room floor. Darnell hit rewind, played it again, leaned closer. Every word, every note, the same cadence, the same places where Amara would pause and hum instead of sing. The same improvised ending she'd added the week before she died. He played it a third time, hands flat on the desk, heart slamming against his ribs like something trying to escape a cage. It wasn't possible. It wasn't logical. It wasn't anything his brain could process through the frameworks of deals and data and risk assessment that had governed his entire life. But there it was. On a screen, in a bathroom, at 2:47 in the afternoon. A homeless woman who had cried alone on his bathroom floor commanded herself to keep going and then sat beside his sleeping son and sang his dead wife's lullaby, word for word, note for note, like a prayer passed between 2 women who had never met. And Darnell Whitfield, who had spent 41 years trusting nothing he couldn't verify, felt something inside him surrender to a truth he could not explain. 3:30 in the afternoon, playroom camera. Jalen's eyes opened slowly, the kind of waking that happens in layers. First the eyelids, then the fingers curling tighter around the teddy bear. Then, a small shift of the body rolling from his side to his back on the sofa cushion. The blanket Keisha had tucked around him was still in place, every edge neat, every fold intentional. Keisha was sitting on the floor near the hallway. Not reading this time, she was folding laundry. A small pile of Jalen's clothes she'd found in a basket near the dryer. T-shirts, tiny socks, a pair of pajamas with rockets on them. Nobody had asked her to do this. It wasn't in any job description. It wasn't part of any deal she'd made with Darnell at a gas station 9 hours ago. She was folding a stranger's child's laundry because her hands needed something to do, and care was the only language they'd ever spoken fluently. Jalen sat up, looked around the room, found Keisha, and did something none of the cameras had recorded before that day. He got off the sofa and moved toward her. Not fast, not eager, but deliberate. A slow crawl across the hardwood floor, bare in one arm, his body closing the distance that had existed between them since morning. He stopped about 2 feet away, the closest he'd been to her all day. Close enough to touch if either of them reached out. Neither did. Keisha kept folding. Calm, steady, her hands moving through the motions like a metronome. She didn't look up, didn't say, "Oh, you're awake," didn't shift her body toward him or open her posture in invitation. She simply continued to exist in his proximity and let him decide what happened next. Jalen watched her hands for a long time, the way she smoothed each crease, the way she paired the small socks together, the careful, patient rhythm of someone who treated even the smallest task like it mattered. Then, he did something that made Darnell, watching from his office 47 floors below, lean so far forward his chair nearly tipped. Jalen lifted the teddy bear. Amara's bear. The one he hadn't let go of for 8 months. The one he slept with, ate beside, carried to every room like an oxygen tank. The last physical connection to a mother who existed now only in photographs and fading perfume and the silence where her voice used to be. He placed it in Keisha's lap. Keisha's hands stopped moving, a folded shirt suspended in midair. She looked down at the bear, sitting in the valley of her crossed legs. Worn brown fur, one eye slightly loose, a faded ribbon around its neck that had once been red. She understood what this was. This wasn't a child sharing a toy. This was a child handing over the most sacred thing he owned to someone he'd decided through hours of silence and patience and star-shaped sandwiches was safe enough to hold it. Keisha looked at Jalen, his brown eyes watching her, waiting. "Thank you," she said softly. "That's all. 2 words, no performance, no exaggerated reaction. Just acknowledgement, just respect for the weight of what he'd just done." Jalen opened his mouth, and Darnell's hand gripped the edge of his desk. "Mama," 1 word, spoken like a stone dropped into still water, quiet, heavy, rippling outward in every direction. The first word Jalen had spoken in 8 months. But he wasn't looking at Keisha when he said it. He was looking at the bear. His eyes locked on that worn brown fur, and what Darnell saw on his son's face wasn't confusion. It was memory. The bear had unlocked something, placing it in another woman's lap, in a lap that was warm and present, and sitting on the floor, the way his mother used to sit, had opened a door in Jalen's mind that grief had sealed shut. He wasn't calling Keisha Mama. He was remembering his, and Keisha knew it. She didn't correct him. Didn't say, "I'm not your mama, sweetie." Didn't redirect or clarify or do any of the clinically appropriate things a trained professional might have been tempted to do in that moment. Because Keisha Monroe understood something that no textbook could teach, and no certification could provide. She understood that a 4-year-old boy sitting on a floor holding out the word mama like a lantern in the dark did not need accuracy. He needed safety. He needed someone to hold the word without flinching. "I know, baby," Keisha whispered. "I know you miss her." And she opened her arms. Not wide, not dramatic, just enough. An invitation, not a demand. The way you hold open a door for someone and let them choose whether to walk through. Jalen crawled into her lap, curled against her chest, and cried. Not silent tears. Not the muted internal grief he'd been carrying like a backpack full of stones for 8 months. This was sound. This was a 4-year-old boy, finally allowing his body to make the noise that matched the pain. A wail that started in his belly and rose through his chest and broke open in the air of a penthouse that had been drowning in silence for 2 years. Keisha held him, both arms. The bear pressed between them, and she cried too. Not for herself, though she had every reason. Not for her own loss, though it lived in her bones every second of every day. She cried because she recognized this sound. She knew it like her own heartbeat. The sound of a child grieving someone they cannot get back. She'd heard it in her own chest every night for 3 years. And hearing it from this boy, this small stranger who had chosen her lap as the place to finally break, cracked open something in Keisha that she thought had calcified beyond repair. In child psychology, there's a concept called earned secure attachment. It means the moment a child allows themselves to feel pain in the presence of another person. Not because the person fixed anything, not because the person performed comfort or offered solutions, but because the person was simply there, consistent, unthreatening, patient enough to let the child come to them on their own terms. Keisha hadn't done anything extraordinary that day. She'd read a book, made a sandwich, folded laundry, waited. And in that waiting, she'd given a 4-year-old boy the rarest thing in his world. Permission to hurt out loud. Darnell watched from his office, tears running down his face. His son's voice, the voice he hadn't heard in 8 months, filling the room through a laptop speaker, One word, Mama. And then, the sound of crying. The most beautiful, devastating, necessary sound he'd ever heard. If this moment is breaking your heart the way it broke mine, take a second to subscribe. Now let's find out who Keisha Monroe really is. Darnell picked up his phone, called his executive assistant Vanessa before the tears on his face had dried. I need you to find everything you can on a woman named Keisha Monroe, 33 years old, currently staying at the shelter on Jefferson Street. Everything, Vanessa. Employment, history, education, family records, everything. Silence on the other end. Then, carefully. Do you want me to contact the police? Mr. Whitfield, did something happen? No. Darnell's voice was steady, but the edges were frayed. Nothing happened. I just need to understand something. 2 hours later, Vanessa sent a file to his encrypted email. 7 pages. Public records. Employment verification. Academic transcripts. A newspaper clipping from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution dated 3 years prior. Darnell opened it in his office. Door closed. Camera feed still running on the second monitor. He read the first page, and his breath stopped. Keisha Denise Monroe. Born August 14, 1993. East Point, Georgia. Graduated Spelman College, 2015. Bachelor of Science in Nursing, Dean's List. 3 semesters. National Black Nurses Association Scholarship recipient. Employed at Grady Memorial Hospital, Atlanta. Pediatric Nursing Unit. 6 years. Performance evaluations consistently rated exceptional. Specialized in trauma-informed care for children with developmental and emotional needs. Certified in pediatric advanced life support. Trained in play therapy and nonverbal communication techniques for children experiencing selective mutism. Darnell read that last line twice. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't improvising. She wasn't a random woman on a gas station step who happened to be kind to children. She was a trained pediatric nurse who had spent 6 years caring for kids exactly like Jalen. Every choice she'd made today, the distance, the silence, the parallel presence, the food placed without pressure, every single thing had been deliberate, professional, rooted in years of experience with children who had lost the ability to trust. He turned the page, and the air left the room. A newspaper clipping. Small. 2 paragraphs. From the community section of the AJC. Zuri Elise Monroe. Age 5. Daughter of Keisha Monroe of East Point. Passed away on March 11th after a 2-year battle with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. She is survived by her mother. A celebration of life will be held at Cascade United Methodist Church. Darnell sat back in his chair, closed his eyes. Let the information settle into him like rain into cracked soil. 3 years ago, Keisha Monroe had lost her daughter, 5 years old, the same age Jalen would be in 11 months. Leukemia, 2 years of hospitals and treatments, and hope held together with tape and prayer, and then gone. The pages after that told the rest. Employment termination, 4 months after Zuri's death. Inability to perform duties in the pediatric unit. A note from her supervisor expressing deep sympathy but citing repeated absences and emotional distress that compromised patient safety. Loss of health insurance. Eviction notice 3 months later. A spiral that no safety net caught because the system wasn't built to catch women who fall apart from the inside out. And the lullaby. Darnell understood now. Keisha had sung that song to Zuri. Her own version. Her own words. The way mothers do when the original lyrics aren't personal enough, aren't specific enough, aren't soaked in enough of their particular love for their particular child. She had rewritten the song the same way Amara had. Not because they knew each other, not because of some supernatural connection, but because 2 mothers in 2 different worlds had loved their children with the same ferocity. And that ferocity had shaped the same melody into nearly identical words. 2 women. 2 children, 2 versions of loss, 1 song. Darnell looked at the camera feed. Keisha was sitting on the playroom floor. Jalen beside her now. Not in her lap anymore, but close. Leaning against her arm, Bear in his hands. Quiet again, but differently quiet. The silence of a child who had cried himself empty and found for the first time that emptiness could feel like relief instead of absence. She wasn't a stranger. She was a mirror, a mother without a child caring for a child without a mother. And somewhere in the space between those two losses, something was growing that Darnell could not name but could not deny. He closed the file, looked at his hands, looked at the screen, and for the first time in 2 years, Darnell Whitfield did not know what to do next. Not as a CEO, not as a strategist, not as a man who controlled outcomes, but as a father. As a human being standing at the edge of something too large for money to measure and too important for logic to contain. 6:03 in the evening. Kitchen camera. Keisha moved through the penthouse like a woman erasing herself. Methodical, thorough, the kind of cleanup that doesn't come from house pride, but from practice. From years of occupying spaces that don't belong to you and learning to leave them exactly as you found them. She started in the kitchen, washed every dish she'd used, dried them, put them back in the cabinets in the exact position she'd found them, wiped down the counters with a paper towel, folded the paper towel neatly and placed it in the trash, closed the trash lid, pushed in the kitchen stool. She moved to the living room, refolded the throw blanket and draped it over the back of the sofa at the precise angle it had been that morning, straightened the couch cushions, picked up the wooden blocks Jalen had played with, and returned them to the shelf in the playroom, arranged by size the way they'd been before she arrived. Then she found the teddy bear. Jalen had set it down on the floor near the spot where she'd been sitting all day. The spot that now, even though she'd moved, still seemed to pull the boy closer. She picked up the bear gently, held it against her chest for a moment, breathed in, then placed it back on the playroom floor in the exact spot where Jalen always kept it, right side up, ribbon straightened. She was removing every trace of herself, every fingerprint of her presence, not because she was hiding something, but because this was what she knew. Shelters, temporary beds, spaces that belong to other people. You use them carefully, and you leave them clean, and you don't assume you'll be invited back. That was the unwritten rule of a life lived on borrowed ground. But then she stopped. Camera angle, kitchen counter. Keisha sat down on the stool she'd just pushed in, reached into her bag, the same backpack she'd carried from the gas station. She pulled out a piece of paper, wrinkled, torn from a notebook, and a pen. A single ballpoint pen with a chewed cap, the kind you pick up from a bank counter or a doctor's office lobby. She began to write. Slowly, carefully, each letter drawn with the deliberation of someone who knew these words mattered more than anything she'd said out loud all day. Her hand paused between lines, not because she didn't know what to write, but because the weight of it kept catching in her throat. 10 minutes. The camera recorded every second, her lips moving silently as she wrote, testing the words before committing them to paper. When she finished, she folded the letter twice, walked to the playroom, placed it beside the teddy bear, rested her hand on the bear's head for one beat, then pulled away. Jalen sat near the television. The screen played a cartoon he wasn't really watching, but he'd positioned himself on the floor right next to the spot where Keisha had spent most of the day. Her absence from that spot hadn't erased the gravity of it. He orbited the place she'd been like a planet that had found its sun and didn't yet know it had moved. Keisha stood in the hallway near the elevator. She looked back at the penthouse one final time. The marble floors, the 14-foot windows, the skyline burning orange in the early evening light. A home worth more than she would earn in 100 lifetimes. A home that for 8 hours had felt impossibly like somewhere she belonged. She took one breath, held it, let it go. Then she spoke. Soft, barely audible, meant for no one alive in that room. Thank you, Zuri. Mama can still do this. Mama can still love. The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. The doors closed behind her, and Keisha Monroe disappeared from the 47th floor like smoke through a window crack. No goodbye, no payment collected, no forwarding address, just a folded letter, a clean kitchen, and a 4-year-old boy who had spoken for the first time in 8 months because a stranger sat on his floor and waited. The $500 Darnell had left on the hall table sat untouched. crisp bills fanned out exactly the way he'd placed them that morning. She hadn't taken a cent. 6:45 in the evening. The elevator opened into the penthouse, and Darnell stepped out. The first thing he noticed was the silence. But it was a different silence now, not the oppressive, suffocating quiet that had lived in this apartment since Amara died. Something had shifted. The air itself felt lighter, like a room that had been holding its breath all day and finally exhaled. Jalen sat on the playroom floor, Bear in his arms. But the way he held it had changed. Before today, the boy clutched that bear like a life raft. Rigid, desperate. White-knuckled grip on something he was terrified of losing. Now, he held it softly, against his chest. The way you hold something you love, rather than something you're afraid will disappear. Keisha was gone. Darnell knew it before he looked. The apartment was too still, too clean, too restored. He walked to the hallway table. The $500 sat there untouched. 5 crisp $100 bills. Every one of them exactly where he'd placed them, at 7:45 that morning. She'd spent 11 hours in his home, fed his son, folded his laundry, sat on his floor for hours without complaint, cried alone in his bathroom, sang a lullaby that shouldn't have existed, and left without taking a single dollar. His mother's voice tried to surface, tried to say something about strategy, about playing the long game, about people who refuse money now to take more later. But the voice was thin, weak, a candle flame in a windstorm. Darnell saw the letter. It sat beside the teddy bear on the playroom floor. A piece of notebook paper, folded twice, slightly wrinkled at the edges. He picked it up. His hands were already unsteady. He unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, but not perfect. Careful but trembling at the edges, the way handwriting looks when someone is trying very hard to hold themselves together while putting something important into words. Dear Jalen, you do not know me, and that is okay. But I want you to know something. Your mama is still here. She is in every breath you take. She is in every tear you cry. She is in that bear she gave you, in the way it smells, if you hold it close enough, in the way it feels against your cheek when you sleep. I know what it is like to miss someone so much your body forgets how to work. My little girl Zuri left me 3 years ago. She was 5. She had eyes like yours. She used to hold her stuffed bunny the same way you hold that bear. Some days I still forget how to breathe. Some mornings I wake up and reach for her before I remember she is gone. But today, sitting with you, I remembered something I had been trying so hard to forget. Love does not leave. It just changes shape. It becomes the air you cannot see but always breathe. It becomes the warmth you feel when no one is holding you. It becomes the voice in your head that says you are going to be okay, even when everything says you are not. Your mama did not leave you, baby. She could never leave you. She just moved from the outside to the inside, and she is in there, right behind your heartbeat, waiting for you to be ready to hear her again. Be brave, little one. You are not alone. You never were, Miss Keisha. Darnell set the letter down on the floor. His hands were shaking. Not the controlled tremor of a man suppressing emotion in a boardroom. This was different. This was the shaking of a man whose entire operating system had just been rewritten by a piece of notebook paper and a ballpoint pen from a bank lobby. He looked at Jalen. His son looked back at him. Brown eyes. Amara's eyes. Clear, present, not empty. Not absent. Here. Darnell did something he had not done once in the 2 years since his wife died. He sat down on the floor. Not on the couch. Not in the armchair. Not at the kitchen counter with his phone and his emails and his deals. On the floor, cross-legged, 3 feet from his son. Exactly the way Keisha had sat that morning. Same position. Same distance. Same silence. He didn't reach for Jalen. Didn't pull him close. Didn't say I love you, or it's going to be okay, or any of the phrases he'd been throwing at this child for months, like keys at a lock that none of them fit. He just sat, present, still, available. The way a woman he'd known for 12 hours had taught him without saying a single word. Jalen looked at him, at his father, sitting on the floor for the first time, down at his level, beneath the desk and the deals and the empire. Just a man, just a dad, sitting on the floor with his son, and Jalen spoke his second word of the day. Dada. Soft, almost a whisper, but it landed in Darnell's chest like a thunderclap, like a door opening after 2 years of knocking, like the first drop of rain after a drought so long you forgot what water sounded like. Darnell Whitfield, CEO of an $8.7 billion empire, a man who had closed deals with heads of state and never flinched, broke apart on his playroom floor, shoulders shaking, tears falling onto the polished hardwood, his hand reaching out, trembling and resting on his son's small knee, the first voluntary contact between them in months. Jalen didn't pull away. He looked at his father's hand, looked at the tears, and slowly, with the careful deliberation of a child deciding to trust the world one more time, he placed his own hand on top of his father's 2 hands. One large, one impossibly small, resting on a 4-year-old's knee on the floor of a penthouse that had finally, for the first time since Amara left, begun to feel like a home. And between them, Amara's teddy bear, and beside it, a folded letter from a woman who had nothing left in the world except the ability to love, and had given it freely, without being asked, without being paid, without even staying long enough to see what it had done. 7:23 the next morning. Darnell pulled his Maybach into the gravel lot behind the Jefferson Street shelter. No driver, no assistant, no Vanessa with her clipboard and her caution. Just a man in a plain jacket who hadn't slept more than 40 minutes the night before. The shelter was a converted church fellowship hall. Cinder block walls painted beige a decade ago. Metal cots visible through cloudy windows. A hand-painted sign near the entrance read Capacity 64. Below it, someone had taped a piece of paper. Currently full. Waitlist open. Keisha sat on the front steps. Same backpack. Same posture. Same book in her hands. The whole brainchild. Its spine cracked deeper than yesterday. Pages soft from being turned too many times by hands that had nothing else to hold. She looked up when his shadow crossed the concrete. And the first thing out of her mouth wasn't hello. I didn't take the money, she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were already building walls. I want you to know that. I didn't come to your home for money. I came because you asked, and your son needed someone, and I could help. That's all. I know, Darnell said. He sat down on the step beside her, not across from her, not standing above her, beside her. On concrete that was cold and cracked, and nothing like the marble in his penthouse. I'm not here about the money. Then why are you here? Because of the letter. Keisha went still. Her fingers tightened on the book's cover. Darnell reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded piece of notebook paper, held it between them the way he'd held the $500 the morning before. But this time the gesture meant something entirely different. You wrote that love doesn't leave, that it just changes shape. He paused. I need to know how you know that. Not from a book, not from a theory. How do you know that? Silence. The shelter door opened behind them, and a woman in scrubs walked out heading to a night shift somewhere. Traffic passed on Jefferson Street. A pigeon landed on the railing and left again. Keisha closed the book, set it on the step beside her, and began to speak. I grew up in East Point, 4 miles from where you found me yesterday. My mama raised 3 of us by herself. Daddy was gone before I turned 2. She worked 2 jobs, housekeeping at the airport hotel during the day, stocking shelves at a grocery store at night. I was the oldest. I was watching my brother and sister by the time I was 9, cooking dinner, checking homework, braiding my sister's hair for school. She looked at her hands. That's where I learned. Not from school, not from a degree, from being 9 years old and responsible for people smaller than me, who needed someone to make the world feel safe. I got a scholarship to Spelman. Nursing, graduated 2015, got hired at Grady Memorial, pediatric unit, 6 years. I loved it. Not the way people say they love their jobs at dinner parties. I mean, I loved it the way you love breathing. Those kids were everything to me. The ones nobody else wanted to sit with. The scared ones. The ones who wouldn't talk. The ones who flinched when you reached for them. I knew how to be with them because I'd been one of them. Her voice dropped. And then I had Zuri. My daughter. Born healthy. 7 pounds 4 ounces. Full head of hair. Loudest cry in the delivery room. She was perfect. She was mine. And for 3 years, everything made sense. A pause. Long enough for the traffic to cycle through a red light and back to green. They found it when she was 3. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The doctor said the word, and I remember thinking he must be talking about someone else's chart. Someone else's daughter, because my daughter just learned to ride a tricycle last week. My daughter just told me she wants to be a butterfly when she grows up. Not a doctor, not a princess. A butterfly. How does a child who wants to be a butterfly have cancer? 2 years. 2 years of hospitals and treatments, and nights sleeping in a chair next to her bed, listening to machines beep. 2 years of watching my baby fight, something no child should have to fight. She was brave. Mr. Whitfield. Braver than me. She never complained. She just kept asking me to sing to her. The same song every night. Our song. The one I made up for her when she was a newborn because the regular words never felt like enough. Darnell's breath caught. The lullaby. The one the camera had recorded. The one that matched Amara's version note for note. Zuri died on March 11th, 5 years old. I held her the whole time. Sang the song until she stopped breathing. And then I kept singing because I didn't know how to stop. The nurses had to take her from me. I wouldn't let go for 45 minutes. They had to pull my hands off her body, and I kept singing into the empty air. Keisha's jaw tightened. Eyes dry. The tears had been cried out years ago. What was left was something harder, something forged. After that, I couldn't go back to the pediatric unit. I tried, 3 times. Every time I walked in and saw a sick child, I saw Zuri. I couldn't separate it. My supervisor understood. She gave me time, but time ran out. The hospital had policies, absenteeism, performance standards. They let me go with a letter of sympathy and a box of my things. Insurance ended 30 days later. I couldn't afford Cobra, couldn't afford the apartment without insurance covering my antidepressants. Missed 2 months of rent. Eviction. Then the shelter. Then the wait list. Then the street on bad nights. She looked at Darnell. I'm not homeless because I'm lazy, Mr. Whitfield. I'm homeless because the system doesn't have a place for grief. There's no leave policy for a broken heart. Nobody holds your apartment while you learn how to live without your child. Nobody pauses the bills while you remember how to breathe. Nearly 1 in 3 women in shelters like this one had steady work before everything collapsed. We're not failures. We're people who fell and found out the net has holes in it. Darnell sat on that step and let every word settle into him like stones dropped into water, each one sinking deeper than the last. He thought about the nanny cam footage, about the way Keisha had cut chicken into pieces small enough for a 4-year-old to chew safely, about the way she'd known to wait, to not push, to let Jalen come to her. 6 years of pediatric nursing. 6 years of children who flinched and wouldn't speak. She'd spent her entire career learning the exact skills his son needed, and then life had stripped everything from her except the knowledge itself. He understood the lullaby now. 2 mothers, 2 different lives, 2 children, loved so fiercely that the standard words of a standard song couldn't contain it, so both women had done the same thing. Rewritten the lyrics, made them personal, made them theirs. And, by some miracle of love's mathematics, the 2 versions had converged into almost the same song. Not because of coincidence, because love, when it's that deep, speaks a universal language. I have a proposal, Darnell said. Keisha looked at him. Guard up. The posture of a woman who had learned that when people with money make proposals, the terms usually aren't in your favor. I want to hire you, full-time, as Jalen's caregiver. Not a babysitter, not a temp, a real position, employment contract, salary, health insurance, and a place to live. There's a 1-bedroom unit on the 4th floor of my building. It's been empty for 2 years. It's yours." Keisha opened her mouth. Darnell raised one hand. "I'm not finished. The position comes with a condition. I want you to go back to nursing. Jalen needs you now, and I need you now. But you need your career. Long-term, permanently. I'll cover the full cost of recertification. Emory has a program. Night classes. You take care of Jalen during the day. You study at night. When you're ready to go back to the hospital, you go, and I'll find someone else for Jalen. But until that day, we need you." He paused. "Both of us." Keisha stared at him. The walls in her eyes flickered. Not falling yet, but shaking. "Why do you trust me? You've known me for 1 day. You don't know anything about me except what's in a file." Darnell pulled out his phone, opened the Nanny Cam app, turned the screen toward her. She saw herself, on the bathroom floor, hands over her mouth, shoulders shaking, then standing, splashing water, looking in the mirror, whispering 5 words. "I watched everything," Darnell said quietly. "I saw you cook for my son and not eat. I saw you stand in front of a refrigerator full of food and close the door with shaking hands. I saw you cry alone on my bathroom floor when you thought nobody was watching. And then I heard you tell yourself to get up, because he needed you, a child you'd known for 6 hours." His voice cracked. "And then I watched you sing my wife's lullaby to my son, the song nobody else in the world was supposed to know, and you sang it like you'd written it yourself, because in a way you had, for a different child, in a different life, but the same love." He set the phone down. "My mother taught me never to trust strangers. She said people with nothing to lose are the most dangerous people alive, and I believed her for 41 years. But my wife taught me something different. Amara said that sometimes grace shows up in disguise, that miracles don't look the way you expect, that the person who saves you might be the last person you'd choose." He looked at Keisha. "Yesterday, I chose to believe my mother. I put cameras everywhere. I treated you like a suspect. I watched every move you made and waited for you to prove her right." His jaw tightened. "You proved her wrong. Every single hour. Every single frame. You proved her wrong with a star-shaped sandwich and a closed refrigerator and a lullaby. And today, I'm choosing to believe Amara." Keisha's face changed. Not dramatically, not a collapse, just a slow dissolution of something she'd been holding rigid for 3 years. The walls in her eyes trembled once more, then cracked, then fell. She cried. Not silently, not behind closed doors, not with her hands clamped over her mouth to keep the sound inside. She cried in front of another human being, on a shelter step, in broad daylight, with traffic passing and pigeons landing and the world doing absolutely nothing to mark the significance of this moment. It was the first time Keisha Monroe had cried in front of anyone since the night she held Zuri's body and wouldn't let go. 3 years of solitary grief, 3 years of bathroom floors and bitten pillows and silent breakdowns in places no one could see. And now, sitting on concrete next to a man she'd met 24 hours ago, she let someone else witness her pain. Darnell didn't touch her, didn't put his arm around her, didn't say it's going to be okay. He sat beside her and let her cry the way she had let Jalen cry, present, still, unhurried. The way someone sits with pain they respect too much to rush. When the tears slowed, Keisha wiped her face with the back of her hand, looked at him, red-eyed, raw, stripped of every defense. Darnell extended his hand, palm open. Keisha looked at it. A hand that signed contracts worth hundreds of millions. A hand that built an empire from a neighborhood 4 miles from where they sat. A hand that was offering not charity but partnership. Not rescue but a road. She took it. Her grip was trembling but firm. The handshake of a woman who had been drowning for 3 years and just felt something solid beneath her feet. "Deal," she said. And on a cracked concrete step in front of a shelter on Jefferson Street, 2 people who had both lost everything that mattered made an agreement that would change both of their lives. Not with a contract, not with lawyers, with a handshake and a word and the terrifying, impossible decision to trust. Month 1. Keisha moved into Unit 412. A one-bedroom on the 4th floor of the same building where Darnell's penthouse occupied the top. Clean, simple, laminate counters. Builder-grade carpet. A window that faced east catching the morning sun. It wasn't luxury, it was stability. And for a woman who'd slept on a metal cot for 11 months, stability felt like a cathedral. She started with Jalen 5 days a week. Same approach as the first day. Quiet presence, patience, no pushing. The playroom floor became their territory. Keisha with her book, Jalen with his bear. The distance between them shrinking a little more each day. Week 2. Jalen said water when he was thirsty, pointed at his cup, then looked at Keisha and spoke the word like he was testing whether the air would accept it. She filled the cup without fanfare. No celebration, no clapping. Just a glass of water handed to a boy who had asked for it with his voice. Week 3. More please. 2 words, strung together. When Keisha poured more milk at breakfast, she wrote it down in a small notebook she kept on the kitchen counter. Week 3. Jalen said more please. Requested food verbally for the first time. Progress. She kept that notebook like a scientist logging data points. Every word, every gesture, every new behavior. Not because anyone asked her to, but because she understood that healing isn't a moment. It's a pattern. And patterns need to be tracked to be trusted. Month 3. Jalen gave Keisha a name. Not Mama, not Miss Keisha, Miss K. He said it on a Tuesday morning, standing in the playroom doorway, bare under one arm, looking at her with those brown eyes that were starting to hold something other than absence. Miss K. Pancakes. 3 words. A name. A request. A sentence. Keisha stood at the stove with her back to him so he wouldn't see the tears running down her face. Pancakes coming right up, she said, voice steady, hands not. She didn't correct him, didn't insist on her full name. Miss K was enough, more than enough. It was a child, choosing to call someone something personal, something that belonged just to them, and that was worth more than any title she'd ever held. Month 5. Keisha enrolled in the recertification program at Emory University School of Nursing. 3 nights a week, 6 to 10. She'd spend the day with Jalen, take him to his speech therapy sessions on Tuesdays and Thursdays, then hand him off to Darnell at 5:30, change clothes, eat a granola bar in the car, and drive 45 minutes to campus. She slept 4 hours a night, sometimes 3. But there was something in her eyes that Darnell noticed during those months. A brightness. Not the brightness of someone well-rested. The brightness of someone who has a reason to be tired. Purpose-driven exhaustion looks different from despair-driven exhaustion. It stands straighter. It moves faster. It doesn't apologize for taking up space. Month 8. A Tuesday afternoon, Darnell's phone rang, Jalen's preschool. He answered expecting a problem. Instead, the teacher, Mrs. Calloway, was laughing. "Mr. Whitfield, I have to tell you what happened today. We were doing show and tell." Jalen stood up in front of the whole class. He held up a drawing of a butterfly. And he said, "Miss K taught me that butterflies start as something small and become something beautiful." And then he sat down like he'd just read a doctoral thesis. Darnell stepped into the hallway outside his office, closed the door, stood there for 5 minutes, hand over his mouth, shoulders shaking. "Miss K taught me that. 5 words. But inside those 5 words was the entire arc of a boy who'd gone from silence to sentences. From a child who wouldn't look at a stranger to a child who stood up in front of a room full of people and spoke about beauty. And he'd credited the woman who taught him that the world was safe enough to open his mouth again. Darnell started coming home for dinner every night. Before Keisha, he'd eaten at his desk. Takeout in styrofoam containers between emails. Meals consumed alone in a penthouse that echoed. Now, he was home by 6, sitting on the floor. Lego towers with Jalen. Spaghetti that Keisha made from a recipe she'd learned from her mother. The 3 of them around a table that had been empty for 2 years. He called his mother on a Sunday evening. Lorraine picked up on the first ring, the way she always did, the way mothers do. "Mama, there's someone I need to tell you about." He told her everything. The gas station, the cameras, the lullaby, the letter. the bathroom floor, all of it. Lorraine listened without interrupting. When he finished, the line was silent for a long time. "You trust this woman?" Lorraine asked. Her voice was careful, measured, the voice of a woman who had spent 67 years building walls to protect her son. "I do," Darnell said, completely. Another pause. Then, softer than he'd heard her speak in decades, "If you trust her, I'll try." Lorraine flew to Atlanta 2 weeks later. She walked into Darnell's penthouse wearing her Sunday dress and the expression of a woman preparing to find every flaw in the foundation. She shook Keisha's hand with the grip of a retired boxer, looked her up and down, sat on the couch with her purse on her lap like a shield. 10 minutes of small talk. Stiff. Careful. 2 women circling each other like diplomats negotiating terms. Then Jalen ran into the room. "Miss K, come see. I built a castle." Keisha knelt down. Jalen took her hand and pulled her toward the playroom, chattering, animated, alive. A boy who 8 months ago had been a silent island in the middle of a marble ocean, now dragging the woman who'd built a bridge to him out of nothing but patience and peanut butter sandwiches. Lorraine watched from the couch. 20 minutes. She watched Keisha sit on the floor with Jalen, watched her grandson laugh, heard his voice fill the apartment like sunlight through a window that had been boarded up for years. At the 30-minute mark, Lorraine Whitfield set her purse on the floor, walked to the playroom doorway, and looked at Keisha with eyes that were full. "You remind me of me," she said quietly, her voice breaking at the edges like ice in spring. "Single mother, lost everything, kept going anyway. I spent 40 years telling my son not to trust people like us because I was afraid of what would happen if the world let him down the way it let me down." She wiped her eyes. "I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm sorry it took me this long." Keisha looked up at her. 2 women. Different generations. Same scars. Same survival instinct. Same love made harder by the weight of carrying it alone. "You were protecting your son," Keisha said. "That's never something to apologize for." Lorraine nodded, sat down on the playroom floor, next to Keisha, next to Jalen, on the floor. The same floor that had become the common ground where broken people learned to trust each other again. And for the first time in his life, Darnell watched his mother sit on a floor and play with a child without worrying about who was watching or what it meant or whether the world was about to take it all away. 18 months later, Keisha Monroe walked through the front entrance of Grady Memorial Hospital, Pediatric Wing, 3rd floor. The same hallway she'd walked out of 3.5 years ago carrying a cardboard box of personal items and a grief so heavy it bent her spine. The nurses at the station saw her first, then the charge nurse, then Dr. Patrice Coleman, the attending physician who'd written Keisha's termination letter with tears in her own eyes. One by one they stood. Someone had placed a bouquet of sunflowers on the counter. Zuri's favorite flower, they remembered. Keisha stopped in the doorway, the same doorway, the exact threshold where her old life had ended and her free fall had begun. She looked at the floor, took one breath, then another. The first step across that threshold was muscle memory. The second step was harder. The second step required choosing to walk back into a room full of sick children, knowing exactly what it costs to love someone small and fragile and not guaranteed. She took the second step, and the hallway erupted in applause. 3 weeks later, Darnell stood at a podium in the ballroom of the Four Seasons Atlanta. 200 people, investors, hospital administrators, social workers, city officials, press. He announced the creation of the Zuri Monroe Foundation, named not for himself, not for his company, not for his brand, for a 5-year-old girl who loved butterflies and died in her mother's arms while a lullaby played. The foundation's mission was specific, not broad philanthropy, not vague goodwill, targeted support for women in healthcare professions who had lost their careers due to mental health crises, grief, or caregiving burnout. Emergency housing, recertification scholarships, counseling, job placement, a net built to catch the people the system let fall. And, sitting in the front row, wearing scrubs, because she'd come straight from her shift, was Keisha Monroe, not as a guest, not as a beneficiary, as the foundation's program director. because no one in that room understood the holes in the net better than a woman who'd fallen through every one of them. That night, after the cameras left and the ballroom emptied, Darnell sat alone in his penthouse. Jalen was asleep in his room, door open, nightlight on. The sound of a 5-year-old breathing steadily drifted down the hallway like proof that the world still worked. Darnell opened his laptop, pulled up the Nanny Cam archive, scrolled back. 18 months, found the date, found the timestamp. 2:47 in the afternoon. He pressed play. There she was, Keisha, on the bathroom floor, knees to her chest, hands over her mouth, shoulders shaking with a grief she refused to let anyone hear. A woman who had lost everything sitting in a stranger's bathroom, breaking apart in the only private space she could find, then standing, splashing water, looking in the mirror, and whispering 5 words to her own reflection. Not today. He needs you. Get up. Darnell watched it one more time, then closed the laptop. He had installed those cameras to catch a thief, to confirm his suspicion, to prove that a homeless woman given access to a billionaire's home would take whatever she could and disappear. But what the cameras actually caught was proof of something else entirely. Evidence that goodness exists even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. That a woman with nothing can stand in front of abundance and choose restraint. That a stranger can hold a child's grief like it was her own. That love survives the worst thing that can happen to a person and still finds a way to reach across the distance and touch someone new. The Nanny Cam was designed to watch her. But in the end, it was Darnell who finally saw himself clearly for the first time. This story is a work of fiction. The names, characters, places, and events are products of imagination or used fictitiously. But the issues it explores are not. Childhood trauma is real. Selective mutism affects thousands of children in the United States who have experienced loss or abuse. Most of them are not defiant. They are not difficult. They are protecting themselves from a world that took something they cannot replace. Homelessness among working women is real. According to the National Alliance to End Homelessness, roughly 1 in 3 women currently living in shelters held steady employment before a medical crisis, a mental health emergency, or a caregiving catastrophe pulled the ground out from under them. They are not lazy. They are not broken. They are people who fell and discovered that the system they paid into their entire working lives does not know how to catch them. When I wrote this story, I thought about the mothers fighting alone in rooms no one sees. I thought about the children sitting in silence because they don't have the words for what they've lost. I thought about the women sleeping in shelters tonight, who have degrees on their walls and resumes that would impress anyone at a dinner table, but who cannot access the life those credentials were supposed to guarantee. Keisha Monroe does not exist, but women like Keisha do. Thousands of them, in every city in America. Nurses, teachers, social workers, caregivers. Women who spent their careers holding other people together, and then had no one to hold them when they fell apart. If this story makes you look at a homeless person on the street differently, even for 1 second, even just long enough to see a face instead of a category, then it did what it was meant to do. If you or someone you know is experiencing homelessness, grief-related job loss, or a mental health crisis, these resources can help. The National Alliance to End Homelessness at endhomelessness.org. The SAMHSA National Helpline at 1-800-662-4357 and 211.org, which connects individuals to local services, including shelter, food, and counseling. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And remember, kindness counts most when no one is watching.